The council chamber was the biggest room Sira Voss had ever sat in. It floated in space, orbiting a dim yellow star that nobody owned. The walls were made of a dark material that absorbed light, and the ceiling was open to the stars through a thick layer of transparent alloy. 300 seats rose in a half-circle around a central platform, and almost every seat was filled. Delegates from over 200 species sat in those chairs, tall ones, small ones, ones that breathed different gases and sat behind sealed helmets, ones with 4 arms, ones with no visible eyes at all. The room smelled like recycled air and old power. Sira sat alone at the center platform. She was a human woman in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and dark brown skin. She wore the deep blue uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, with a single gold stripe on each shoulder. No medals, no decorations. She had never liked wearing medals. She carried a data pad in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other, because the session had already been going for 4 hours and she had stopped pretending to be fully awake. She was not afraid. People who knew Sira Voss well said that she had 2 modes. The first was calm. The second was very calm. There was no third mode. She had spent 30 years in space, on colony ships, on border stations, in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and she had learned that fear was most useful before a situation, not during it. Right now she was in it, so she kept the fear somewhere quiet and paid attention instead. The Galactic Council was in the middle of reading a statement. The speaker was a tall, pale creature called a Velhari. They had 6 fingers on each hand and a long neck that moved in slow, elegant waves when they spoke. The Velhari were old. Their civilization was nearly 4,000 years ahead of humanity's, and they spoke with the kind of patient authority that came from never having been seriously challenged. The speaker's name was Counselor Drevon, and Drevon had been reading the statement for 11 minutes now. It was an ultimatum. The Kreth Dominion, a reptilian empire that occupied a large section of the galaxy's eastern arm, was demanding that humanity surrender 3 outer colony worlds. The worlds were called Varen's Rest, Hollow Reach, and the New Castle Station. Together, they held about 400,000 human colonists. The Kreth said the worlds were in disputed territory. They said that a human patrol fleet had fired first on a Kreth survey vessel 8 months ago near the Varen corridor, and that these 3 worlds were fair reparation for the lives lost and the insult done to the Dominion's honor. The Council endorsed the demand. Not all of them were happy about it. Some of the smaller species looked uncomfortable. A few delegates were not meeting Sira's eyes, but the vote had been taken in a closed session 2 days earlier, and the result was clear. The Council believed that giving the Kreth what they wanted was the best way to keep the peace. The Kreth were powerful. They had a large fleet, a long history of winning wars, and a reputation for making the cost of resistance extremely high. The Council had been managing the Kreth for centuries, by giving them just enough to stay satisfied without giving them everything. It had worked mostly. Drevon finished reading the statement and folded all 12 fingers together on the table in front of him. He looked at Sira with large, amber eyes that were completely unreadable. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "the Council asks for the formal response of the human government." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a speaker. The deep, held-breath quiet of 200 species watching something they suspected might go badly. The Kreth ambassador, a massive reptilian figure named Vraxal, who sat in a reinforced chair to Sira's left and had been watching her all morning with yellow slit eyes, leaned forward slightly. He was not worried. He had been in this chamber many times before. He knew how this worked. The smaller powers always gave the right answer eventually. Sira set her coffee down on the table. She set her data pad beside it. She straightened the cuffs of her uniform sleeves, slowly, like she had all the time in the galaxy. Then she looked up at Counselor Drevon. "We don't negotiate with murderers," she said. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the chamber exploded. Voices came from every direction at once, the sharp clicking sounds of Kreth translators converting the outrage, the high whistling tones of the Elhari delegates, the deep bass rumble of the Torvani who communicated partly through vibration. Drevon raised all 12 fingers for order. It took nearly a minute for the room to settle back down to something manageable. Vraxal was standing. He was very large when he stood. He was nearly 2.5 meters tall, with heavy scales the color of dried blood and hands that ended in thick, curved claws. He did not raise his voice. The Kreth considered raised voices a sign of weakness. He spoke in a low, steady tone that the translators rendered as careful and cold. "That is an act of war," he said. Sira looked at him. "No," she said, "it's a statement of fact." "You accuse the Dominion." "I haven't accused anyone of anything yet," she said. "I said we don't negotiate with murderers. That's a policy. It doesn't require an accusation. It just requires us to know what we're looking at." Drevon intervened before Vraxal could respond. "Ambassador Voss." His voice was careful and controlled, the voice of someone managing a situation he had not expected to need managing. "The Council strongly encourages the human government to consider the terms being offered. They are reasonable. They are." "They're a surrender," Sira said. "They are a path to peace." "For whom?" She looked around the chamber slowly, letting her eyes move from delegate to delegate. Some looked away. Some held her gaze. For whom is it peace? For the 400,000 people on those 3 worlds who would be handed to the Dominion. For the colonists on Varen's Rest who have already seen what the Kreth do to populations they consider inconvenient. The room was very quiet again. Vraxal said, "The Kreth Dominion does not recognize the legitimacy of human presence in the Varen corridor." "I know," Sira said, "that's the problem." She picked up her data pad. She stood up. She was not a tall woman, and standing did not make her imposing in the way that Vraxal was imposing. But there was something in the way she moved, unhurried, final, like someone who had already decided how the conversation ended, that made the room stay quiet. "The Council will have our full response within 48 hours, she said. "In writing, with documentation." Drevon frowned, which on a Velhari looked like a slow folding of the upper face. "Ambassador, the Council expects." "I know what the Council expects," she said. "I've been doing this job for a long time." She tucked the data pad under her arm. "You expected me to say yes, or to ask for more time, or to ask for modified terms, or to make a counteroffer that the Kreth could reject, and then make another demand, and we'd go round and round until we talked ourselves into a surrender that didn't feel like one." She glanced briefly at Vraxal, who had not moved. "We're not going to do that." She picked up her coffee. It was still cold. "We'll be in touch," she said. She walked out. The doors of the council chamber were large, designed for species far bigger than humans, and they opened slowly on hydraulic hinges that took 8 full seconds to complete the movement. Sira walked through them at a steady pace and did not look back. Behind her, she could hear the chamber erupting again, voices, tones, clicks, vibrations, all layered on top of each other in something that sounded very much like panic. In the corridor outside, her aide, a young man named Torin, fell into step beside her. He was 26 years old and had been with her for 8 months, and he was very good at his job, which was why he said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Finally, quietly, he said, "Did that go the way you planned?" Sira drank the last of her cold coffee. "Ask me in 48 hours, she said. They walked on down the corridor. The stars moved slowly outside the long windows, indifferent and bright, the way they always were. Somewhere far behind them in the direction of the Varen corridor, a Kreth war fleet was already being told to prepare for movement. Sira knew this. She had known it was coming for a long time. That was the thing about being ready. It didn't make the moment less tense. It just meant you had already decided what you were going to do when it arrived. She had decided a long time ago. The human embassy vessel was called the Meridian Cross Asterisk, and it was not a warship. It looked like one, to people who didn't know better. It was long and dark, with angular lines and a hull that absorbed sensor signals rather than reflecting them. but it carried no weapons heavier than point defense systems, and most of its interior space was filled not with guns or ammunition, but with servers, rows and rows of data storage running the length of the ship in climate-controlled silence. The Meridian Cross was an intelligence vessel. It was the most expensive thing humanity had ever built that wasn't technically a weapon, and it had been sitting quietly in the neutral zone near the council station for 3 years, watching and listening and collecting. Commander Dax Oren ran the ship. He was a lean man with close-cropped hair and the kind of permanent tiredness behind his eyes that came not from lack of sleep, but from knowing too much for too long. He had spent most of his adult life in intelligence work, intercepting signals, analyzing patterns, finding the stories hidden inside data that other people had tried to make invisible. He was very good at it. He was also, at this particular moment, sitting at the main operations table on the Meridian Cross with 17 data files open and a very specific problem in front of him. The problem was timing. He knew what Sierra Voss was going to say in the council chamber. He had known for weeks. They had planned it together, over long comm sessions and longer silences, working through every possible response the council and the Kreth might give. What he held in his hands, what his team had spent 3 years collecting, was the evidence. And now that Sierra had made the move, the evidence had to go out at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the council could suppress it or frame it as human propaganda before it spread. Too late, and the Kreth would have already begun turning the story into something else. He watched the feed from the council chamber on a small screen in the corner of his table. He watched Sierra say the words. He watched Vraxal stand up. He waited exactly 12 more minutes, letting the chaos in the chamber reach its peak, letting every news relay in the system pick up the story of the human ambassador walking out. And then he looked at the young analyst sitting across from him, a woman named Yassi who had not slept in 31 hours and still looked sharper than most people did fully rested. "Send it," he said. Yassi pressed a single key. Across every open comm channel in the neutral zone, across the news relays, the diplomatic feeds, the public information networks that linked the council species together, a data package went out. It was large. It contained recordings, transcripts, sensor logs, and 17 witness testimonies. It contained a video file that was 43 minutes long and had no narration, no music, and no editing. It was raw footage from a surveillance satellite that the Meridian Cross had placed in the Varen corridor 8 months ago, before the incident that the Kreth were calling a border skirmish. The footage showed what had actually happened. It showed 3 Kreth warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel above Varen's rest in the early morning hours of a day that the colony's residence had begun as an ordinary one. It showed the colony's single patrol vessel, one small ship with a crew of 18, attempting to establish contact. It showed the Kreth warships not responding. It showed the patrol vessel moving to a defensive position between the warships and the colony, still broadcasting on open channels, still asking for identification, still trying to prevent something rather than start it. It showed the Kreth warships opening fire on the patrol vessel without warning. It showed the patrol vessel breaking apart. It showed the Kreth warships then turning their weapons on the colony below. Varen's Rest had been home to 63,000 people, families, farmers, engineers, children. The colony had been in place for 22 years, long enough for a second generation to be born there, long enough for people to call it home. The Kreth warships spent 4 hours systematically destroying every structure on the surface. The satellite footage was silent and distant, the kind of footage that showed a planet from space, and what it showed was a world going dark. It also showed the escape pods. 11 escape pods had launched from the colony during the attack. The satellite footage tracked all 11 of them. The Kreth ships had shot down 10. One had gotten away. That was how the testimony existed at all. The single escape pod that survived had carried 9 people, including a woman named Heron Soul, who was a school teacher and whose testimony was the last item in the data package. She spoke for 20 minutes in a flat, careful voice, and she described what she had seen from the pod's small window as it moved away from the planet. She described what the surface had looked like from above. She did not raise her voice once. It was the most devastating thing in the entire package. Dax watched the data spread across the networks in real time. His analysts tracked the transmission as it was picked up by relay after relay, bounced from station to station, downloaded and reshared by thousands, and then tens of thousands of receivers across the council systems. The speed of it was extraordinary. In an age where every species had its own media networks and information moved at the speed of light between stars, a story this significant didn't spread, it detonated. Within 2 hours, the footage had been viewed by an estimated 300 million individuals across 14 species. Within 3 hours, it had been authenticated by 4 independent verification services, 2 of them run by non-human organizations with no political connection to Earth. Within 4 hours, the Kreth ambassador had held a press briefing in which he called the footage fabricated, described it as a human provocation, and demanded the council take action against the *Meridian Cross* for what he called illegal surveillance activity. Dax had expected that. What he had not fully expected was the reaction from the Elhari delegation. The Elhari were a small, graceful species, bird-like, with hollow bones and large, dark eyes, who had been council members for over 800 years. They were known as quiet diplomats who rarely made strong public statements. Their lead delegate, an elder named Thesevi, had been in the council chamber for 40 years. She had seen a great deal. She was not easily moved. She issued a public statement within 5 hours of the data drop. It was short. It said that the footage was consistent with events the Elhari had long suspected but never been able to prove. It said that her people supported a full investigation. It said, in language that was very careful but impossible to misread, that the Elhari considered the Kreth's actions at Varen's Rest to be a crime and not a border incident. It was the first crack. On the *Meridian Cross*, Dax read the Elhari statement twice, and then set it down and looked out the viewport at the stars. He thought about Heron's soul, who was currently living in a resettlement facility on Earth's moon, who had agreed to have her testimony included in the package after a long conversation with one of his analysts, who had said simply that she wanted people to know what had happened and then had gone quiet. He thought about the 10 escape pods. "Commander," Yassi was looking at her screen, "we're getting signals from the Torvani homeworld and from the unified moons of Ceph. They're both requesting direct secure channels with the embassy." "Open them," he said. "There's also," she paused, "there's a signal from inside the council station. It's coming from one of the support staff channels. It's encoded in a format we've seen before." She looked up. "It's from one of the species that voted with the Kreth in the closed session." Dax raised an eyebrow. "What does it say?" Yassi looked at her screen again. "It says, 'We knew, we are sorry, we want to help.'" Dax was quiet for a moment. "Hold that channel," he said. "Don't close it, don't respond yet, just hold it open." He stood up and moved to the viewport. Outside, the neutral star was small and pale, not particularly beautiful, just a point of light among thousands. How many delegates voted for the ultimatum? 162. How many of them knew what happened at Varen's Rest and said nothing? Yassi was quiet for a moment. "Based on the intercepts we have, at least 40, possibly more." Dax nodded slowly. This was the part of the work he had always found the hardest, not the collecting of evidence, not the logistics of distribution, but the moment when the truth was out and you had to sit with what it meant. 40 species that had seen or suspected a massacre and stayed silent because the Kreth were powerful, and silence was easier than justice. He had spent a long time being angry about that. Right now, he needed to use it instead. "Get me a secure line to Ambassador Voss," he said, "and start drafting the second package, the one with the council communications." Yassi looked up sharply. "We're releasing that too." "Not yet," he said, "but I want it ready." He turned from the viewport. "The Kreth are going to try to make this about us. About human aggression, human surveillance, human ambition. They're going to try to turn the story around." He picked up his coffee. "We need to make sure everyone understands that this was never just about humans." He looked at the screen where the data was still spreading, still moving outward across the networks at the speed of light, reaching further with every passing minute. "Varen's rest wasn't the first time," he said quietly, "and if nothing changes, it won't be the last." He drank his coffee. It was at least hot. Outside, in the direction of the eastern arm of the galaxy, a Kreth fleet of 600 ships was already moving. The Varen corridor was a long stretch of open space between two star clusters, mostly empty, mostly dark. It was the kind of place that appeared on navigation charts as a blank area between more interesting destinations. No inhabited worlds, no stations, no resource value worth mentioning. Ships passed through it on the way to somewhere else. That was all it had ever been good for. The Kreth admiral, whose name was Goreth Vel, liked that about it. He stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Dominion's Tooth Asterisk, and watched the corridor on the main display screen. The screen showed a long, dark stretch of nothing, exactly as he had expected. His fleet sat behind him, in a formation that his navigation officers had spent 2 days arranging for maximum visual effect. Because the Kreth understood that war was often decided before the first shot was fired, and that the sight of 600 warships arriving in a system was frequently enough to end a conflict before it began. He was not worried. He had studied humanity's military capacity extensively in the months leading up to this moment. The humans were a young species, barely 150 years into serious space travel. They had colonies, yes. They had a small fleet, yes. Their ships were functional and showed some interesting design choices that his engineers had noted with mild professional interest. But they had nothing that could seriously threaten the Dominion. Their largest engagement in recorded history had involved 47 vessels. He had 600. This was not a battle, this was a demonstration. After the demonstration, the humans would give up the 3 worlds. And after that, the Kreth would give them a few years of peace before asking for something else. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked with the younger species. You pushed until they understood the shape of things, and then they fell into the correct position and stayed there. The navigator spoke. "Admiral, we are approaching the Varen insertion point." "Execute jump," Goreth Vel said. The fleet jumped. The corridor appeared around them, long and dark, exactly as the charts showed it. The Dominion's Tooth Asterisk came out of faster-than-light travel smoothly, and the display screen updated immediately to show real-time sensor data from the surrounding space. Goreth Vel looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. The corridor was not empty. There were ships in it, human ships. They were sitting in a formation that covered the corridor from edge to edge, arranged in a pattern that was clearly deliberate and clearly military, placed exactly where they would intercept any fleet trying to push through toward the colony worlds. The sensor data updated as his systems worked to count them, and the number climbed and kept climbing. "Navigation," he said, his voice carefully flat. "Confirm sensor count." "Confirmed, Admiral." The navigator's voice was less steady than his. "We are reading 812 vessels, human configuration, all types: carriers, destroyers, heavy cruisers, long-range strike platforms." A pause. "They are fully powered, weapons cold." Weapons cold meant they had not charged their firing systems. It meant they were not pointing anything at him. It meant they were waiting. 812 ships. Goreth Vel had spent 30 years in the Kreth military. He had commanded fleets in 4 different conflicts. He had a precise and experienced understanding of what a fleet of 800 ships meant in terms of firepower, range, tactical options, and the absolute brute fact of presence. He ran the numbers automatically, the way he always did, and the numbers were not comfortable. He had 600 ships. His fleet was individually powerful. Kreth warships were among the best built in the galaxy, heavily armored, well-armed. But 800 human ships, even smaller ones, even individually weaker ones, arranged in a prepared defensive formation in a corridor that naturally funneled any attacking force. The math was not simple anymore. The math was, in fact, very complicated in ways that he did not enjoy. He thought about what his intelligence reports had said about human military capacity. He thought about how wrong they apparently were. A communications signal opened on his command deck. It came from the center of the human formation, from a vessel that his sensors identified as the flagship, a large, dark ship that carried no visible identification markings but sat at the precise center of the formation like a spine. The signal was clean, clear, and perfectly calm. Sierra Voss's voice came through the bridge speakers. "Admiral Goreth Vel," she said, "my name is Sierra Voss. I'm the human ambassador to the Galactic Council and the commanding officer of Task Force Iron Meridian. We've been expecting you." Goreth Vel said nothing for a moment. Then slowly he said, "How long have you been here?" 3 days, she said. "We wanted to make sure we were in position before you arrived." He looked at the screen again. 812 ships, weapons cold, waiting. "You've been hiding this fleet," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was more like a man picking up a piece of information and turning it over, examining it. "We've been keeping it quiet," she agreed. "We're a careful people, Admiral. We like to know what we're doing before we do it." A brief pause. "You have 1 hour." 1 hour for what? "To recall your fleet to Kreth space, to transmit the coordinates of your war council to the Galactic Tribunal for formal proceedings, and to surrender the names and locations of the officers who gave the order at Varen's Rest." Her voice did not change. It was not hard or angry. It was simply the voice of someone stating terms. "After that hour, we stopped being patient." Goreth Vel did not respond immediately. On his command deck, he could see his officers looking at their screens, looking at each other, not looking at him. He could feel the weight of 600 ships behind him and 800 ships ahead of him, and a corridor that offered very few tactical options. He had not hesitated in 30 years. He pushed the feeling down and kept his voice level. The Dominion does not accept ultimatums from lesser powers. "I understand," Sierra said. "You have 58 minutes." The channel stayed open. She didn't close it. She just waited. Goreth Vel turned to his tactical officer. "Options," he said quietly. The tactical officer, a competent young soldier named Kraxis who had served under Goreth Vel for 6 years, looked at his screen for a moment and then looked up. His expression said everything his words were about to confirm. "A direct push through the corridor is inadvisable, Admiral. Their formation covers the approach entirely. We would be taking fire from 3 directions before we cleared the first defensive line." He paused. "A flanking option exists but requires splitting the fleet and would take approximately 9 hours to execute, during which they could reinforce their position or advance on our entry point." Another pause, longer this time. "A strategic withdrawal and regrouping is also an option." Goreth Vel understood what that meant. It meant retreat. He had never retreated. "There is another factor, Admiral." This came from his communications officer, a woman named Tesla who handled signal intelligence. She was looking at her screen with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. "I'm monitoring public channels. The human data release, the footage from Varen's Rest, it's been authenticated by independent services. It's spreading." She looked up. "Our own junior fleet captains are accessing it, sir. Several of them have been sending private signals to each other in the last hour." Goreth Vel went very still. "What kind of signals?" Tesla hesitated. Questions mostly, about the incident, about the orders, about whether she stopped. "Whether what?" She met his eyes. "Whether the footage is real, sir." The bridge was very quiet. Goreth Vel stood at the front of his command deck and looked at the 812 human ships sitting in the corridor ahead of him, weapons cold, waiting, and he understood something that he had not understood when this morning began. The humans had not just brought a fleet, they had brought the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was harder to fight than any weapon system his tactical officer could name, because it had already gotten inside his own ships, inside his own crew, and was asking questions that 600 warships and 30 years of military certainty had not prepared him to answer. The hour ticked forward. He did not give the order to advance. He did not give the order to retreat either. Not yet. He stood at his screen and watched the human formation and thought about 10 escape pods, one of which had survived, and the schoolteacher whose testimony was apparently now circulating among his junior captains. 51 minutes remained. He had never hesitated in 30 years. He was hesitating now. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called at 3 in the morning, station time. It didn't matter. Every delegate came. They came quickly, some of them still in the clothing they wore off-duty, some of them with the slightly distracted look of people who had been watching news feeds for hours and had come to the chamber still processing what they had seen. The chamber filled faster than it had for any session in living memory, and when the lights came up fully and Counselor Drevon called for order, the room was already loud. Drevon looked older than he had the previous day. The Velhari did not age the way humans did. They could live for centuries and show very little physical change, but there was something in Drevon's face that had not been there 24 hours ago. A tiredness. A weight. He called for order 3 times before the room settled, and when it did, the quiet was not the respectful quiet of a body ready to conduct business. It was the tight, unhappy quiet of people waiting for something difficult. The first hour was chaos in formal clothing. Species after species took the floor. Some of them were angry at humanity, the Gret Coalition delegates, 3 species that had long economic relationships with the Kreth Dominion, argued that the data release was illegal, irresponsible, deliberately provocative. They called for sanctions. They called for the expulsion of the asterisk Meridian Cross asterisk from neutral space. One delegate, a squat, heavily armored creature from a world called Durac Prime, stood up and said with complete seriousness that humanity had declared war on galactic stability, and that the Council had an obligation to side with the Kreth in order to maintain order. Several heads around the chamber nodded at this. Sierra Voss was not present. She was monitoring the session from the asterisk Meridian Cross asterisk, sitting beside Dax Oren at the operations table, watching the feed on a screen while the hour ticked forward in the Varen corridor. She had sent a junior diplomat to observe and take notes. She did not feel the need to be in the room. The session was not really about her. It was about what the Council was going to do with the truth now that it was out. The shift came from the direction nobody expected. Thesavi of the Elhari did not ask for the floor. She simply stood up, and something about the way she did it, the slowness of it, the deliberateness, the age in her small body and the absolute steadiness in her large dark eyes, caused the room to go quiet on its own. She had been a council delegate for 40 years. In that time she had given 3 floor speeches. Everyone in the chamber knew that. When Thesavi spoke, it was because she had decided that silence was no longer something she could afford. She spoke for 17 minutes. She did not talk about humanity. She did not talk about the Kreth fleet moving through the Varen corridor. She talked about her own people. She told the chamber about a world called Ethais Minor. It was an Elhari colony, small and quiet, that had sat on the edge of what was then disputed territory between the Elhari and the Kreth Dominion 63 years ago. She described what had happened to it in language that was plain and careful and very specific. The way she named the number of dead, the way she described the diplomatic meetings afterward, the way she explained the choice that the Elhari Council of Elders had made. They had been shown evidence privately by a Velhari intermediary that the Kreth had destroyed Ethais Minor deliberately, and they had been told, also privately, that presenting this evidence publicly would destabilize the region, that the Kreth would deny it, that no one would act on it, and that the most practical path forward was a quiet settlement. They had taken the settlement. They had received 2 systems in compensation, signed quietly, no public record, and they had said nothing. We told ourselves it was wisdom, Thesevi said. Her voice was calm and even. We told ourselves that we were protecting what remained of our people by not provoking a conflict we might lose, and perhaps that was partly true. But it was also true that we were afraid, and that fear dressed itself in the language of pragmatism so that we did not have to look at it directly. She paused for a long moment. For 63 years we said nothing. And for 63 years, the Kreth learned that the price of what they did at Ethai's Minor was 2 systems and some paperwork. The chamber was completely silent. The humans lost 63,000 people at Varen's Rest, she said. They have evidence. They have witness testimony. And they are in that corridor right now with 800 ships because they decided, as we did not decide, as many of us did not decide, that some things cannot be managed. They can only be answered. She looked around the chamber slowly. I am not here to tell you to support humanity. I am here to tell you that I am ashamed of what my people chose 63 years ago, and that I will not make that choice again today. She sat down. The room did not erupt the way it had the day before. It stayed quiet in a different way. The way a room goes quiet when something true has been said, and there is no easy response to it, and everyone knows it. Then, one by one, things started to happen. The Torvani delegation, large, stone-skinned beings from a heavy-gravity world who had always been considered politically neutral, submitted a formal statement of support for a full, independent investigation into the Varen's Rest incident. The unified moons of Seth, 7 small species that operated as a single political bloc, withdrew their earlier endorsement of the Kreth ultimatum. A species called the Havari, who had not spoken publicly in 3 council sessions, requested floor time and used it to submit a secondary piece of evidence. Their own surveillance records from a different incident, 7 years old, in a different corridor, a different colony, a different set of coordinates for the same pattern of behavior. It turned out Varen's Rest was not the first time. This was not a surprise to Dax Oren, who had suspected it. It was not a surprise to Sira Voss, who had been counting on it. But hearing it stated publicly, in the council chamber, by a species presenting their own independent records, was different from suspecting it. It made something solid out of something that could still have been argued as a single incident. In the Kreth diplomatic box, Vraxal sat very still. He had spent the morning trying to work the room, speaking privately to delegates, offering assurances, questioning the authenticity of evidence, suggesting that humanity's behavior was the real destabilizing factor here. He was good at this. He had been doing it for decades, but the ground beneath the conversation had shifted in a way that his usual tools were not built for. You could not flatter or pressure or financially incentivize your way out of a publicly authenticated video of escape pods being shot down. You could only deny it and hope the denial held. The denial was not holding. His communications aide leaned close and whispered that there was a signal from the Kreth High Command. Vraxal excused himself from the chamber and took the call in a private corridor. The voice on the other end belonged to one of the military advisors to the Emperor, a man named Harith Kal, whose job it was to speak difficult truths to powerful people. The fleet has not advanced, Harith Kal said without preamble. Vraxal said nothing for a moment. Explain. Gorethvel is holding position. He has been at the insertion point for 3.5 hours. The human formation has not moved. He has not engaged. A pause. There are reports of communication issues within the fleet, junior officers asking questions. Several captains have formally requested clarification on the rules of engagement. Vraxal pressed his clawed hand flat against the wall. Gorethvel does not hesitate. He is hesitating, Harithkal said simply, and the council is watching. After the call ended, Vraxal stood alone in the corridor for a moment. He was a practical being. He had not reached his position through emotion or ideology, but through a clear and consistent ability to understand what was achievable and what was not, and to navigate the space between them. He looked at the situation the way he always looked at difficult situations, as a set of variables, as a problem to be managed. The variables had changed. The fleet was hesitating. The council was fracturing. The evidence was authenticated and spreading. And in the chamber behind him, an Ilhari elder who had been silent for 40 years had just publicly called what happened at Ethai's Minor a crime and drawn a direct line from there to Varen's rest. He thought about the emperor. He thought about the war council. He thought about 40 years of careful positioning, carefully managed relationships, carefully maintained fear. He thought about 800 human ships sitting in a corridor with their weapons cold, and their hour running out. The variables, he decided, required a new approach. He straightened his uniform and went back into the chamber. He did not have a plan yet, but he knew one thing clearly: the situation that had existed yesterday, where the council endorsed the Kreth, where humanity was isolated, where the truth was buried, that situation was gone. It had ended when a schoolteacher's testimony went out on every comm channel in the neutral zone, and an old Elhari woman decided she had been quiet long enough. The question now was what came next. In the Varen corridor, the clock was still running. Gorathvel had 18 minutes left. 7 minutes before the hour ended, the Kreth fleet transmitted a signal. It came through on the open channel that Sira Voss had been holding, the same channel she had used to deliver the terms, the same one that had been sitting open and quiet for the better part of an hour while 600 warships sat in the dark and thought about what to do. The signal was short. It was not a full surrender. It was not a formal acceptance of the terms she had laid out. It was, in the measured language of military communication, a request to pause the timeline and open formal dialogue. In another situation, from another opponent, that might have been a stalling tactic. Sira read it twice and then looked at Dax. "They're not advancing," Dax said. He was watching the sensor feed from Task Force Iron Meridian. "They haven't moved in 4 hours. Gorathvel's request mentions technical consultations with High Command," she said. "That means he's waiting for the Emperor to make a call." "Yes," she set the message down, "which means the Emperor is weighing his options." She thought about this for a moment. Outside the viewport of the Asterisk Meridian Cross Asterisk, the neutral star was beginning to set behind the station, a long, slow dimming that happened once every 31 hours and served as the closest thing the neutral zone had to a day-night cycle. She had been awake for most of the last 2 of them. She was tired in the specific way that came from high concentration over a long time, the kind of tired that didn't feel like sleepiness so much as a slow reduction in the thickness of the world around her. She picked up the document she had been working on for 6 months. It was called the Varen Accord. It was 41 pages long. It was written in plain language that had been carefully translated into the 17 most widely spoken languages in the Council region, and it had been reviewed by 11 legal scholars, 4 diplomatic historians, and 1 very patient Elhari archivist named Thesavi, who had been quietly helping Sira work on it for the last 3 months in a series of private late-night comm sessions that neither of them had mentioned to anyone else. The Accord had 4 main demands. The first was a full galactic tribunal investigation into the Varen's Rest incident, with independent verification, full evidence disclosure, and binding authority to assign criminal responsibility to individuals, not to governments, not to species, but to the specific people who gave specific orders. The second was reparations, not just for humanity, for every species that had submitted evidence or testimony of similar Kreth actions going back 50 years, the Havari evidence, the Ilhari settlement, 3 other incidents that Dax's team had collected records on that had never been made public. The reparations were not punitive. They were specific, tied to documented losses, assessed by an independent body, paid on a defined schedule. Third was council reform. Any species with evidence of a crime committed by another council member was legally obligated to present it. Silence was no longer a neutral act. Covering up evidence to preserve political relationships was a violation of council membership. The 31 delegates whose private communications, the second data package, the one Dax had kept in reserve, showed knowledge of or participation in suppressing evidence of the Varennes Rest massacre were named in an appendix. The fourth was a permanent monitoring framework for the Varennes corridor and 6 similar disputed zones, run by a neutral body with actual enforcement authority. It was, in short, not just a document about what the Kreth owed humanity. It was a document about what the galaxy owed itself. Sierra transmitted it simultaneously to 3 places: the Kreth High Command, the Galactic Council Chamber, and every public comm channel that had been carrying the story for the last day. She did not wait for a response before releasing it publicly. That was deliberate. The accord was not a negotiating position. It was not an opening offer designed to be argued down. It was a statement of what justice looked like, made public so that every species watching could see it, and so that any attempt to quietly modify or shelve it would happen in full view of 300 million people across 14 species who had spent the last 24 hours watching footage of escape pods being shot down. The reaction in the council chamber was immediate. Drevon received the document on his personal console and read it in silence. Then he read it again. The other delegates received it at the same moment, and the chamber, which had been in a state of high agitation all morning, went through a strange few seconds of quiet as people read and understood what they were holding. Then they reached the appendix. 31 delegates named. 31 species who had known in some form about the Kreth's actions, at Varennes Rest, at Ethais Minor, at the 3 other incidents, and had said nothing, or actively suppressed what they knew, or signed quiet agreements that kept the truth buried. The faces of those delegates went pale. Not metaphorically. Several of them visually changed color: the Velhari who managed blood near the skin surface, the Durac Prime representative whose carapace darkened under stress, 2 of the Gret Coalition species who had pigmentation responses tied to their nervous systems. Across 31 seats, the physical signs of fear were visible and immediate and impossible to pretend weren't there. Vraxal read the accord at his seat in the Kreth diplomatic box. He read it carefully, all 41 pages, and when he was finished, he sat quietly for a moment and then did something that the people around him had never seen him do. He picked up his communication device and called the Emperor. The call lasted 9 minutes. Nobody in the chamber could hear it. But when Vraxal returned his device to the table, his posture had changed in a small and specific way. The way a very large and powerful being changes posture when it has accepted something it cannot reverse. 40 minutes later, the Kreth High Command transmitted a formal signal to Task Force Iron Meridian. It was not everything the accord demanded. It was not a full surrender, but it was real, a commitment to suspend fleet operations, to open communications with the Galactic Tribunal, and to transmit a preliminary list of officers involved in the Varennes Rest operation for formal proceedings. It was, in the vocabulary of intergalactic diplomacy, a crack becoming an opening. In the Varennes corridor, Gorethvel received the signal from High Command and relayed it to his fleet. He stood on his command deck and watched his officers process the information. The relief on some faces, the confusion on others, the complicated expression on Kraxus's face that suggested his tactical officer was doing the same recalculation that Gorethvel himself had been doing for the last 4 hours. The human formation had not moved. 812 ships, weapons cold, still waiting. Gorethvel opened the channel to the human flagship one last time. "Ambassador Voss," he said. "Admiral." A pause. "We will be withdrawing to Kreth space." "I know," she said. "We'll be watching." He closed the channel. Then he gave the order and the Kreth fleet began to turn. It was not a fast process. 600 warships did not change direction quickly. It took nearly 2 hours for the full fleet to complete the maneuver and begin the movement back toward the jump points that would take them home. During those 2 hours, the human formation held its position without moving, without powering weapons, without sending any signal except one short message to Task Force Iron Meridian's fleet captains that simply said, "Hold formation. Let them go." Sierra Voss stood at the viewport of her flagship and watched the Kreth fleet go. Torin stood beside her. He had been with her for most of the last 36 hours and had gotten less sleep than she had, and had not complained about either of those things, which continued to make him very good at his job. "The Council is requesting your presence," he said quietly. "Drevon wants to discuss the accord terms. Several of the named delegates are apparently," he paused, choosing a word, "distressed." "They'll be fine," she said. "They'll have the tribunal to worry about. That'll keep them busy." "What about the reform provisions? Some of the larger species are going to push back on the mandatory disclosure rule. They'll say it infringes on diplomatic sovereignty." "It does," she agreed. "That's rather the point." Torin was quiet for a moment. Then carefully he asked the question he had been sitting on for a while. "Were you ever afraid, during all of this?" She didn't answer immediately. The Kreth fleet was still moving out. The display screen showed the last of them clearing the corridor going back to empty dark space between two star clusters that nobody owned. The neutral star was rising again behind the station, starting its slow 31-hour arc, and its light was coming in through the viewport at a low angle and catching the gray in her hair. "Every second," she said. "That's why we prepared for 40 years." Torin nodded. He seemed to be thinking about this. "The Council is going to be different now," he said. "A lot of things are going to be different." "Yes. Is that good?" She thought about Haren's soul in a resettlement facility on Earth's moon. She thought about 63,000 people on a world that no longer existed. She thought about Thesavi of the Elhari, sitting in a chamber for 40 years with a secret, and the relief on her face when she finally stopped carrying it. "It's necessary," she said. "Good and necessary aren't always the same thing, but sometimes they overlap." In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Tribunal convened. Evidence was submitted. Names were attached to orders. The proceedings were slow and complicated and deeply uncomfortable for a large number of species who had long preferred a version of peace that required not looking at certain things too directly. Species that had never spoken to human diplomats before began reaching out, not because humanity was the most powerful presence in the galaxy. They weren't, not by a long measure, not yet, but because word traveled, and what had traveled was not just the footage from Varen's Rest or the count of ships in the corridor. What had traveled was something harder to quantify and harder to fight. The humans had known exactly what they were doing. They had prepared for 40 years. They had waited for the right moment. They had brought the truth instead of an army, and they had been ready to back the truth up with an army if it came to that. They had not fired a single shot, and they had not lost a single ship, and they had not signed a single document they weren't satisfied with. And they had not, under any pressure at any point, in any room, negotiated with murderers. That, as it turned out, was the thing that the rest of the galaxy remembered. Not the fleet, not the data, not the 41 pages of the Varen Accord, though those mattered enormously and would shape council law for generations. What they remembered was a woman in a blue uniform setting down a cold cup of coffee and saying 8 words in a chamber of 200 species, while the most powerful military force in the eastern arm of the galaxy waited for her to be afraid. "We don't negotiate with murderers." 8 words. And the galaxy had never been quite the same after them.